Dear learners, we are happy to welcome you to the third panel discussion with eminent social scientists conducted by the Politics and International Studies stream of the Department of Social Studies of the Open University of Sri Lanka. This discussion will be made available as a digital archive for all our learners, and they are free to download and make use of it for their studies. This panel discussion is particularly important for the students of Politics and International Studies stream, but it will also be beneficial for those students offering course units related to politics from the Society and Culture stream as well. Today's panel discussion will be on social movements. Previously, we had two other discussions on devolution and political participation. And I am happy to tell you that today also we are having with us Professor Jayadev Uyangoda and Mr. Sunil Bastian. Professor Uyangoda is Professor of Political Science at the University of Colombo and one of the foremost political scientists in Sri Lanka, who has researched and published extensively on ethnic conflict, conflict resolution, democracy and devolution. We are also proud to say that Professor Uyangoda also has worked as Visiting Professor of Political Science at the Open University of Sri Lanka, and he has contributed immensely to develop the Politics and International Studies stream. His name is, I think, very much familiar to you, as it appears in almost all of our textbooks as chairperson, author or editor. Mr. Sunil Bastian too is a well-known researcher and an intellectual. He has immensely published locally and internationally. He has worked as a researcher for several research institutes in Sri Lanka and abroad. He has provided consultancy services for many international organizations. His research work has mainly focused political economy, devolution and democracy and ethnic conflict of Sri Lanka. And we warmly welcome both Professor Uyangoda and Mr. Sunil Bastian for this program. We will start this discussion with the conceptualization of social movements. I would like to refer to Professor Uyangoda how in political science and international studies the concept of social movements has been developed or has been researched or has been theorized.
Well, social movement as a social science concept refers to organized or sometimes spontaneous movements of either resistance or making demands on behalf of social groups, ethnic groups, or can even be on behalf of the entire group of people. Now, historically, social movements predate political parties, and that's important. And we have a tendency to consider political parties as the primary unit of, mobilizing people. But when we look at social history of any country, including Sri Lanka, we can see a long history of social movements by peasants, by working class people, by women, and variety of the social groups are to articulate their demands and to demand from the government certain rights. So therefore, social movements also have played a significant role in political, social and economic transformation within nation states as well as at a global level. That is why social movements are viewed in political science as an important agency and actor in the process of politics.
Yeah, well, tracing the history of social movements, it's interesting to read what Marx talk about international workers' movement. I think Mr. Sunil Bastian can enlighten us on this, because I have read, in literature that they take as the starting point, international workers' movement, because the Marxian point of social movements begin with workers. So
Yeah, you must remember when reading Marx also, you must understand he wrote in a particular period. Especially for me, very often Marx is a product of the Industrial Revolution and workers coming in, and definitely he saw workers as a major force of social change. Then of course what happened with that movement, it got formalized into political parties, several. But even at that time there were workers movement from different camps. There were non-left, non-Marxist workers trade unions. But really the interesting to ask is, just ask the question, how does workers organize now compared to what happened at the time of the Industrial Revolution and immediately after, when the industrialization began in Europe. Today there is a notion of social movement trade unionism, whose way of working is very different from the older trade unions. Now this shows quite an interesting, for example, quite an interesting phenomenon, say migrant workers, even of Sri Lanka. If you look at the organization working on migrant workers now, for one, it's one of the globalized networks. It's found in many countries, but it doesn't believe in the same style of organizing like the old trade unions, right? I think this is one of the big distinctions between the modern social movements and the earlier one. Earlier ones, there was quite a strong, especially those who were linked to political parties, there was strong kind of hope that the capture of state power, getting state power, will be a major means by which you bring about change, right? But the current social movements doesn't talk a lot about capturing state power, but does talks about many other issues, right, that the society faces, for which we have to find answers. Now they work in a variety of, World Social Forum is a very good example to look at. They work in a variety of methods, variety of ways, and there are several issues. The third point I would like to point out is the globalized nature of the social movements now. So it's like even the international trade union, international workers movement was an international. WFTU was a World Federation of Trade Union, or CIFTU was the world, but it was organized in a particular way, had a particular link to also political parties and so on. But the new social movement, new workers movements, organizes differently. They focus on several. They're not that concerned about capturing state power. They're much more concerned about how to put pressure, right? Plus, all of their work is not only national, is international as well.
Yeah, well, Professor Vuyangada, I mean, if I suggest that international workers movement influenced several other social movements like feminist movement and all, how would you?
So the international working class movement, which emerged in the 19th century, is perhaps one of the first organized movements at some kind of a global scale, or at least in the scale of European continent, and it later on influenced the social movements, political movements in other parts of the world. For example, in Asia, now Indian, Chinese, Burmese, Indonesian, even in Japan, trade union movement, and later in Latin American countries, those movements were directly influenced by the 19th century European trade union movement as well as the socialist movement. I think important for us to see the link between the 19th century and 20th century labor movement as well as the socialist movement. Then there was a very significant women's movement in the United States and particularly in the United States for franchise women's rights, and most of these women came from trade unions actually. Now if we extend that discussion to Sri Lanka,
Yes.
even the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, there has been what one may call kind of a new process of political practices in the absence of political parties by various social movements. Now, Sinhalese nationalist movement, for example, which emerged in the second part of the 19th century, is one of the earliest modern social movements in Sri Lanka, and The trade union movement started in the early 20th century, and the franchise movement in Sri Lanka in the late 1920s and 1930s. And subsequently, the scope of activity of social movements expanded to include the human rights movement, the democracy movements, environmental movements, other social service organizations. So there's a, social movement is a term that includes a wide variety of social movements. And one of the defining characteristics of social movements today is that they are at one level national, at another level they are global. So both national and global social movements have a lot of similarities as well as differences. One of the basic similarities in the social movements is that they have, in a way, broken the monopoly of political parties as the primary agency for mobilizing social groups. So in a way, one can argue that social movements exist parallel with political parties as a significant political actor nationally as well as globally.
Mr. Bastian, when you talk about social movements, generally it is all about creating resistance to the established systems, established government, maybe established system of ideas. But is that the only function of social movements? Are there any other functions?
Yeah, no, sometimes, there are instances where they are able to not only resist but actually bring about change, and here actually for a lot of my examples come from the global movement. Take for example, the areas that they have gone into is very wide now. Take the huge campaign that was there for banning of landmines. Mm-hmm. That's one of the most successful social movement campaigns, right?
But these movements are, driven by some other forces. They are not real movements, originated from the people. Can we call these as social as such?
Well, where are the people? Now, of course, when you look at this kind of politics, often it is citizens of a country who are concerned of certain things. I don't think there are many, there may be even organizations, they don't claim that they represent so-called the people. This is kind of very large category called the people. Very often they don't exist, but you have classes, or you have ethnic groups, or sometimes there are organizations who don't claim that they represent people, and I don't think there's anything sacrosanct about value represent of the people. This remind me of Lenin's debate with the Narodniks, where the one group argued that they represent people. The word Narodnik comes from the people. So that is an argument that is legitimized by all kinds of groups to promote this cause or the other. But what is issue? I think for me the issue is what are the main concerns that these groups are talking about, and how they are able to achieve success and so on. Only thing is, now don't forget, I'm not drawing any kind of a black and white picture. These are highly contradictory political phenomena, right? But what we need to understand is, in the modern context, as I think as Wen also said, it's very difficult to understand politics without looking at those. Politics is not confined to traditional political parties.
Can I come in there? The meaning of social in the social movements emerged to make a distinction between social movements and political parties. That is the original distinction. Secondly, social movements also take up mostly issues that are not taken up by the political parties. Sometimes there are many issues that political parties are extremely reluctant to take up in their mobilization. For example, women's rights, environmental rights, rights of migrant workers, even human rights sometimes, so the media freedom. Those are issues that political parties might not always want to champion, because they always make political calculations in terms of electoral gains and losses. But whereas social movements precisely because they work outside the political party framework, take up these issues that political parties would consider as a risk or unpopular. So, in that sense also the social movements are in a way unique in their agendas as well as in their practices.
Yeah, well, I mean, this link between social movements and politics is very important. So, when we look at the experience of Sri Lanka, so how social movements ended up becoming political parties. So, for example, JVP, was it a social movements before it became a political party?
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of them, maybe not. JVP, I will JVP look at much more as a political party. I mean, JVP's politics right at the beginning had all the elements of an organized. It was almost a Leninist party. Organized cadres, and if you look at the way the JVP organized right at the beginning, it has very similar.
But Professor Uyanga has a different view on that.
But the 71 movement, 71, if you look at the variety of organization that were there at that time, right, that had a character of a social movement. I remember trying to write a bit of a history of some of the current organizations, and I traced back to several trends that happened in the 70s, because especially once the JVP insurrection ended, quite a lot of actually individuals came into the other organization, what we began to call as social movement.
To respond to your question, sometimes social movements can evolve themselves into political parties as well. A classic example is the British Labour Party. The British Labour Party originated with the trade union movement, and many social democratic parties in Europe, originally they were working class movements. And in Sri Lanka, not only the JVP, the JHU started initially as an environmental movement. You see, it was an environmental movement, then gradually it evolved itself into a political party. So, even Sri Lanka's political party, UNP, United National Party, was formed in 1947 out of a group of social movements that were active during the 1920s, 30s and 40s. So, there is no clear distinction between the social movements and political parties in terms of their possibilities of evolution.
So, it is not necessary that always they end up becoming a political party, or they just vanish.
No, it can. I think what Uyan meant, the Ceylon National Congress, which was a precursor to
political
UNP.
party.
But Ceylon National Congress was a very broad church, and
but they had from the beginning a political aim, independence. So, can we call it a social movement then?
So, it depends on the concrete example you are discussing. So, sometimes the social movements can have political agendas like the Ceylon National Congress, and take any human rights movements today, a Sri Lankan movement or global movement like Amnesty International, but they are essentially political groups, but they are not political parties. You can't have a social movement without a political agenda. I think we need to make a distinction between social movements and political parties. In another level, the political parties have certain, organizational framework, strict party discipline, elected office bearers, but sometimes social movements might not have those formalized structure. That's another distinction between social movements and political parties. And also, the word social movements was not used in the 19th century or 18th century, although there were a lot of social movements, right? The social movements is a particularly 20th century concept, and that concept emerged along with the evolution of political parties, because the political parties in a way overtook social movements as a prominent actor in politics. But it doesn't mean that the importance of the social movements decline. Now in the modern world, I think the importance of social movements with political agendas is also a very significant factor.
How powerful has that been? Has this actor been? I mean, so far, how powerful?
If you look at politics, there is on one hand we discuss parties and formal politics, but I also use the word politics in this way: a clash of interests, ideas, and values. right? And if you look at each one of these what we call social movements, you can unpack politics in that. Now, how successful? Now, that's a now here I like to present a slightly different idea. A lot of people discuss social evolution with some actually utopias, some normative framework in front. So we ask, have we had proper economic growth? Have we had proper? For me, that kind of framework is I've ditched that long ago. That there's some kind of ideal norm towards we are in a historical context, right? And that historical context presents us variety of challenges, and it is in that context we are operating. Take in terms of success and failures. Take devolution, which we discussed earlier. Just trace how did the idea of devolution got established in this country. The idea of devolution, the fundamental concept. State reforms has to go beyond decentralization. If you trace the ideas, you will see quite a lot of groups that you can put into the social movement were part of that. Or take plantation people getting citizenship rights, which is a major thing, because actually 1949 them losing the citizenship right was one of the biggest beginnings of our conflict. If you trace the history of that actual process happened, you will find what we call social movements was a part of that. But they didn't work alone. It was not that why this kind of very sharp distinction between political parties and social movement doesn't work really. In or women's issue or environment issue, start looking at the history of these ideas and where they are now. This doesn't mean that we have solved problems or anything like that. But if you look at historical evolution of these processes, you will see what we call social movement have played.
Yeah. Professor Vuyangode, can you go to sort of classification? I mean, in terms of the goal of these social movements, can there be violent goals for social movements?
Oh yes. Now, if you take present insurrections all over the world, whether in India or the Philippines or Burma or Germany, those are Latin countries, many of the peasant insurrections were violent. But they were nevertheless social movements. Many of the revolutionary movements initially started as, violent social movements.
Oh, so violent religious movements.
Not all, though. Yeah. Some.
Violent religious movements. I want to come to that point.
Yeah, that's right. It's possible to have violent religious movements as well. Now, the point we need to emphasize here is that social movements is not a homogeneous entity as a concept. There are many varieties.
But
sometimes
when
can
it
be
becomes
peaceful.
social, I want to disturb you here because in my belief, when it becomes social, it can't be antisocial.
No, well, it depends on how you define antisocial, pro-social. You see, that some time ago, that was in about 1980s, the idea of social movements got a kind of a renewal with the emergence of the theory of civil society. So, in contemporary political theory, social movements are looked at as a form of civil society politics. That was particularly after the 1980s. So, social movement theory was also seen in the 1980s as non-party political formations. The Indian political theorist Rashni Kothari wrote this very influential article in the 1980s to describe these civil society and social movements as non-party political formations. These are contemporary meanings of the notion of social movements. So, I think it's very important for us also to introduce to discussion the civil society, the concept of civil society.
Well, Mr. Bastian, now I want to move on to international scenario. So, what is the role of international non-governmental sector in creating social movements or in mobilizing?
Yeah, it's quite interesting when you start looking at the international non-government. How did the word NGO begin?
Yeah.
How did that? Right at the beginning, it was when UN had to give accredited status to the international trade unions. When UN was formed, it was a body of interstate. Only international organization that was there at that time of a significant influence were the trade unions, international trade union federations. And formation of ILO was a kind of a side thing, but that is at least at the point. It is at that point this word began to use, because there is government, main actors of government. Now currently what has happened is what is called very often for me it's very difficult to differentiate between the civil society movements. There is possible. There is one group of international organizations, right, which are basically they represent. Sometimes I call they are agencies, international agency. They represent values. They do have their politics. There's no doubt about it. As if you may use, but their way of working is very different from some other social movement who can mobilize, agitate, and intervene into the political sphere. There have been situations where these two trends have clashed. One good example was one of the Davos conferences in Switzerland. There was a business people, and Amnesty was inside with the business people. World Social Forum was demonstrating outside. Suddenly, Amnesty found itself and it was somewhere in Switzerland, but a huge security clampdown. Amnesty found itself with the
stage company.
With the state. It became so bad they had to come out and make a press statement about the security at that time. So there are many situations where these two things don't go together, right? There are situations where they do go together. So therefore, that, as Wuyan said, it's extremely important to differentiate these trends. It's such a kind of a sphere with wide variety of tendencies. But in terms of global activism, they are pretty effective. Pretty effective in the sense today I don't think any kind of a global political, not that when I say they are effective, I'm not saying they are always doing good or anything like that, but there is very rarely global. Now Peru, just now there was an environment conference. If you look at what happened there will be a lot of the international non-government will be very active there. So they are a sector, they are an established sector. But what's most interesting for me now, because I've been looking at this changes happening, China. There are several new organizations coming from China with a very similar idea. We is one country where we didn't have this kind of groups. Actually, Chinese civil society activism is very, very, very quite strong.
But there is a lot of repression on civil society in China. There is a lot of repression on civil society.
Obviously, there is a lot of repression. I mean, in many countries, they operate with a lot of repression. But it's not a black and white situation. It's not totally a black and white situation, because actually Chinese sphere of blogging is very, very strong. Because I think a lot of people don't follow the Chinese movements of the Chinese migrant workers, movements that have been mobilization that have been taking place in China about losing land. It's fairly widespread.
Yeah, Professor Wuyan, to conclude, what can you predict about the state? I mean, before the rising social movements, I mean, in the world.
You see, one of the important consequences of the rise of modern social movements and civil society, and they have been able to put pressure on the states, nation states or the global state system to be accountable. I think international human rights movement, international environment movements, women's rights movement, right, and World Social Forum, and also human rights and democracy organizations within states have been able to make that very significant contribution. Otherwise, normally the states and governments behave as if they are not accountable to anybody. So that ensuring accountability, even with the resistance from the states, is one of the most important achievements made by the social movements.
Yeah, with that note, we can conclude this discussion on social movements. And thank you very much for participating in this discussion. And I would like to request our learners to download this digital archive and use it for your studies. And thank you very much.